City of Stevens Point Plan Commission meeting, recorded February 3, 2020.
Good evening, it is 6 p.m. I will call to order the February 3rd, 2020 Stevens Point City Plan Commission meeting. Agenda item 1, roll call.
Weeza is excused, Kneebone is excused, Artson.
Here.
Cooper.
Here.
Haynes.
Here.
Hoppy.
Here.
Rice is excused. We barely have it, but we do have a quorum.
All right, good enough, we'll move on. Agenda item 2 is the report of the January 6th, 2020 meeting, pages 2 through 12. Questions, comments, or a motion?
I just found a couple of typos. On item 5, I think to specifically address housing adorability, I think it's affordability.
That would make
Second
sense, yes.
And then another one, Division 7-3, Division Street Plan anticipated to be revived, maybe revised. Although revived could work.
Might have been revived.
That should be reviewed actually in February, not revived or, yes, reviewed. That is the Division Street Targeted Area Master Plan. Will be coming up at the end of February for consideration by the joint bodies.
And then this MSA memo is their revision of what we had seen.
That's correct. Yeah, there was a lot of
Okay.
confusion on that graph, and so
Right.
MSA was kind enough to put together a lengthy memo explaining how they came up with that graph.
Yeah, it's helpful. It is long.
Yeah, but I was able to figure it out. I'd make a motion to approve the minutes with the corrections indicated.
Motion by Commissioner Arnson, we have a second.
Second.
Motion by Commissioner Haynes. Further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed say no. Motion carries. Agenda item 3, request from Delta Dental of Wisconsin for a site plan review to construct an office building at 3100 Business Park Drive, parcels identified, page 13. Director?
Mr. Kearns?
So we have a request before you for site plan review. It is a long-awaited project from Delta Dental. It is a great project. We are very thankful for them for this project. Essentially, it's before this body because within the developer's agreement with Delta Dental, there was a section that identified that Plan Commission and Common Council approval is required. Otherwise, this use is permitted within the zoning district. And the zoning district is a split zone of M1 and M2 within the Portage County Business Park. It is a fitting use for the vacant 15-acre site, and the development encompasses a 3-story, approximately 133,000 square foot building with about 400 open-air parking stalls as well as some other enclosed parking stalls within the first floor or possibly basement of the building. This is the site here. Again, it's encompassing 3 parcels. However, the development will primarily exist on the northern half to central location identified. Here's the site map. It's a very unique building architecturally. It's essentially split in 2 with an atrium in the middle. Here's a site map with further details. Again, all of this has been included within your packet as well as 11 by 17s. So I'll run through this fairly quickly. In terms of architecture of the building, you know, a lot of glass, some stone masonry, veneer materials. It's going to look like a very good building. It's going to stand out in point. We don't have this type of architecture, at least with regards to the curvature of the building within the city, so again, it is a unique development. With that being said, staff, because it is a permitted use, we reviewed it to the typical zoning standards. We look for ingress, egress, access, parking, landscaping, lighting, things of that nature, and majority of those are met. There are a few things within the site plan that need to be corrected, as well as a full landscaping plan needs to be submitted. We have attached conditions to the approval that allow for staff to approve those similar to what we would for a permitted use that did not require Plan Commission and Council approval. The one thing I do want to note is that there were some concerns with regards to ingress and egress on the southernmost driveway, which will line up with a road across, so it'll essentially create a four-way intersection, and it's going to increase the conflict points. So Public Works did have some concerns that maybe a traffic impact analysis be done to help quell some of those concerns that they have. So we added that as a condition as well, and I believe the developer will work with the Public Works Department as well as Community Development to address many of these concerns. With that being said, we would recommend approval with those 8 conditions outlined within the staff report and identified on the presentation.
All right, questions from the commission first, anything before we open it up? Okay, questions from the public?
Tori Jennings, Alder for District 1. I'm hoping the commission will have a little bit of a conversation about the abundance of parking and if that much parking is necessary. It's huge. And I don't know if this is in the plans. Mr. Kearns, perhaps you can elaborate if any new construction, I believe, needs bike parking, and I'm not seeing that in the plans. But I think the philosophy of the city and this commission for a while now is looking at we don't need so much parking. So I hope you have that conversation. Thank you.
Others? Any other public comment on this? Okay, I will bring it back to the commission. Kyle?
I can certainly address those questions. In regards to the bike parking, you'll see number 4, the condition 4 up there regarding the bike parking and bike rack details to be provided. We would ensure that they would meet the applicable code requirements within the zoning code. In terms of parking, they are meeting the parking requirement. I think it was 380 some stalls when taking into consideration the 15% reduction that can be applied when you are located on a bus route or near a bus stop. And so from a maximum standpoint, when they're at 400 and the requirement is 380, they don't have an over and abundance amount of parking where we could prevent them from having those parking stalls. And that's, what they need to succeed. So there's nothing from, zoning standpoint that would allow us to limit their parking at this point, and they would be meeting the ordinance requirements.
Good. Questions?
It doesn't show, but kind of maybe going along with that question posed, the walking path that is on the diagram, I'm assuming that connects with Green Circle and some other routes there. I kind of see the one on the, I guess that would be the south end. Looks like it does, but I'm not sure on the
Correct.
west side where that might connect.
That will connect up to the trail that goes under the interstate near
That does,
Skyward.
okay, that's what I kind of thought. But so those will connect both in and out?
Yes,
Of the-
correct.
okay.
And I believe that's part of the covenants required under the Portage County Planning and Zoning
Trail
Office.
Parker and the planning there, okay.
Yeah, going back to that parking question, Kyle, could you remind me or maybe revisit it? We had these discussions before and that previously, I thought the city or there were specifications for a minimum number of spaces, and then we looked at that, and then is there a maximum number of spaces? I remember we discussed this, and I don't recall just where that ended up, but the idea was, yes, to try to minimize things as we could.
Yeah, so right now we do have a minimum, we do have a maximum. It states in the code on page 17 and 18 that no use shall provide more than 150% of the required parking stalls as shown. So if they're required 380, basically they can, add an additional 100 plus, and they would not be over that requirement of 150%.
And how is that number determined?
It's a percentage of the total required number, and so the total required number is based off of office space within the facility.
And that's what
total
they
square
provide.
footage.
They say this is how many people we expect to,
It's
I
based.
think it's square.
Yep, so
by
in our
square
code, it's
footage or-
based off of square footage, so it's one
Footage.
parking stall per 300 square feet of office space.
I know this may not be a question that, but I'm sure a question that can be answered today, and I don't think the Delta Dental has to answer it as well, but, you know, there may be questions about it of, is there any discussion of what will become of the old building of their current facility?
That's really outside the purview of the
Yeah,
commission.
that's what
Yep.
I thought. So, I mean, I know they don't have to answer that, but just thought maybe I'd pose it.
So does the stormwater plan take into consideration, I assume, not just the building, but also the impervious surface of the parking?
Yes, I believe it does in terms of the county covenants for the park.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
We in community development, because we're not the experts with regards to stormwater, we divert to the utility department to handle the stormwater requirements.
Yeah.
how about the terminal islands and the median island? Could you explain that? What's the purpose?
So the purpose is really aesthetics, to create some breaks in the parking rows. So we require a terminal island every 25 spaces, as well as median islands, median islands every 25 spaces, terminal islands at the end of every row, to, again, create some aesthetic breaks within parking lots and to add some greenery and so forth. However, there is a section of the code that says you can waive those island requirements if you double the landscaping around the parking lot. So the perimeter landscaping, the minimum is 5 feet, and if you double it to 10 feet, as well as all the plantings within that area, you do not then have to do the internal island landscaping. So some of those islands are missing on the site plan as shown. However, because we do not have a full landscaping plan at this point, I've noted that within the conditions of approval that either they would need to install those islands meeting the code requirements or double the landscaping in width on the perimeter.
And the code defines what the terminal islands and median islands.
They do, yep. There's square footage requirements and planting requirements for those islands.
Thanks.
Further questions? What are your wishes?
I would move approval with staff recommendations, the 8 staff recommendations as provided.
Motion by Hoppy to approve,
1 second.
seconded by Commissioner Arnson. Further discussion on the motion. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say no. Motion carries. Agenda item 4, accessory dwelling units. For some folks to clear out.
So, accessory dwelling units is something that I think has been a hot topic amongst staff and some other folks here in the city as we look to address some affordable housing concerns and issues that we have as a community. And so I've asked Mr. Kearns to put together some items, and he'll dive more into it to go over what an accessory dwelling unit is, give you some examples. And really what we're looking for from the Plan Commission tonight is, what are your general thoughts? Is this something that the Plan Commission as a whole is interested in pursuing? Should we put this back into the closet and lock it up? Those types of things. So Kyle, go ahead and take this one.
So I think most people think of an accessory dwelling unit as another unit on site on a single-family residential property where there's housing occurring. Historically, I think Stevens Point has seen these within additions onto existing homes or There are a few examples within the community where lofted areas above garages are created as secondary dwellings. And in most cases, a member of the family or, you know, they're coined mother-in-law suites because, you know, as parents of individuals age, they move back with those individuals and they want some separation on the site. So you can see the definition above as well as an example that's provided. I will say also that historically, if you have a second principal building on a lot within the city of Stevens Point, you do need approval through Plan Commission and Common Council. Now, we haven't done many of these recently. However, there were, I think, 2 or 3 done several years ago where there was, I believe there was a garage that was being rebuilt and they wanted to do a lofted area and put a dwelling unit, a bathroom, a kitchenette within that lofted area, but a member of the family was going to live there. And that is permitted under the code, under the definition of family, which we'll get into shortly. Here are some examples of, you know, an addition at the bottom to an existing home. You've got the lofted area above a garage and then a separate building, which almost looks like a garage that's been converted into an accessory dwelling unit in the rear yard. Again, our definition of family within the code allows right now for members of families to exist within one dwelling unit. This could be husband, wife, their children. This could be their mother and father. And it also allows for one other unrelated person within that dwelling unit. And that can be within an addition, it can be a basement, and upstairs, as long as it's within one dwelling unit. Again, when we start creating a second dwelling unit on the property, a single family property, or a duplex property for that matter, you have to get approval through Plan Commission and Common Council currently under the ordinance, but there aren't any standards of review. It says in the ordinance you've got to meet the conditional use standards, but they're not necessarily tailored to accessory dwelling units. So the question then becomes, with the increasing popularity of accessory dwelling units, do we want to adopt specific standards, as many other communities have done, that specifically regulates accessory dwelling units? These are some of the benefits on the screen from, you know, zoning standards that regulate ADUs. Again, I won't go through them. I've identified all of this in the memo. And, you know, there are some big benefits. It's a way that you can increase housing. And Stevens Point, direction from council, as well as I think this body and in our comprehensive plan, is to increase densities and increase infill development. Accessory dwelling units is one way to do that, where you're not growing necessarily at the periphery with new growth, but you're allowing for additional uses on existing properties that are currently being served by utilities. There's a few examples that we provided in the memo, and I'll go over them quickly here. One is Marshfield. They do call out accessory dwelling units within their zoning code. Both of these examples that I'm referencing require conditional uses in these cases, so that they would have to go through Plan Commission and Common Council to receive that conditional use. But they also have different design standards. They've got size limitations. They also limit the size in comparison to the principal use on the property. They limit the location on site. Most of the time this is for standalone accessory dwelling units. If you're doing an addition onto an existing home, you would have to meet those principal structure setbacks of any home that you would construct. Rapids is the other example referenced. It's very similar in terms of the requirements. And in terms of the districts that they're allowed, most of them allow them in their single-family zoning districts as well as their mixed-use neighborhood districts. So where you're seeing a transition from single-family and two-family residences into the neighborhood commercial areas, but then not being permitted within those strict industrial and commercial areas. The last example that I reference is the 21st Century Land Development Code, which is what we've been looking at as a new zoning code, and I think we're on Chapter 5. It's somewhat stalled because we've placed focus on our comprehensive plan, getting that updated and adopted prior to picking up the zoning code rewrite. But they do it a little bit different. They allow it as a permitted use in certain districts, as well as, I think, as a conditional use in a few districts. Very similar design standards in this code. In summary, you know, they tend to do the same thing. They've got an owner occupancy requirement, dimensional and locational standards, again, to ensure compatibility within the neighborhood. Maximum ADU size requirements. I will note that right now, if you construct an accessory structure, it's limited to 900 square feet. So we do, again, regulate it somewhat within the code. We're just not calling out accessory dwelling units in the code. They've got minimum lot size requirements and limits on the number of occupants and bedrooms, off-street parking requirements, which again our code currently address. One of the biggest differences we see is where they're permitted and where they're conditional, and in what districts we want to permit them and what districts we don't want to see these uses at all. So that's all I have in terms of a summary on the item. Again, we're looking for direction on how we want to move forward. If this is something you think we should entertain and maybe provide some, you know, some more detail in an ordinance, and then we can kind of scale that back and fit it into our current code, or if this is something we want to put off entirely until the zoning code is addressed in the next couple of months here. I think there's value if we do maybe take a bare bones approach under our current zoning code. It would allow for individuals this summer, as we approach the building season, to, you know, construct these accessory dwelling units and not have to wait until the zoning code is adopted if we do hold off. Certainly if we do hold off, it will ensure conformity within the zoning code rewrite if we pursue that project at the same pace that in the same procedure that we've taken it thus far.
Any comments from the commission first?
I'm all for it. Please put it in. I think that would be great. I do have one question, well, a few. On the current, it says a 900 square foot maximum. Is there a minimum size?
The minimum dwelling code that's set by the state is 600 square feet. So in theory, that 600 square foot would be the minimum.
Okay. Which is pretty big, actually. Okay. And then I would support having in some ADUs permitted in certain districts. The other question I have on this, well, one, my pet peeve is the family definition. One question is, why do we define that in the zoning code?
I think it's been defined for several years, if not decades,
Yeah,
in terms of the definition of family.
forever. But that doesn't mean we need it.
Right, and I cite our housing study from 2017 because it recommended to remove that, or at least, you know, unrestrict it a little bit to potentially 3 persons, unrelated persons, which is very similar to other communities around the state. Stevens Point is unique in that we only allow 2 unrelated persons.
Mm-hmm.
Other communities allow more, whether that's 3 or 4,
Right,
you know, in addition to family,
yeah,
or 1 family.
right, yeah.
Something that's been really interesting is when we talk about the definition of family, 2 unrelated individuals and their dependents. That's kind of been something that I've seen a little bit throughout as a lot of communities go through updating their definition of family. Something we might want to consider looking into as well.
Well, yeah, or just getting rid of it.
That too.
All right, that's all I got. Because, well, on the one bullet, limitations on the number of occupants or bedrooms, I would put the limitation on bedrooms rather than occupants. I just don't think that's easily enforced or monitored.
Commissioner Haynes, when you say, just stepping back a little bit on your some permitted in districts, are you thinking our higher density transitional districts, or are you thinking a blanket approach, or are you saying conditional use in maybe our single family, but permitted in 2 and 3 family zoning districts?
Probably in most residential districts, I
Okay.
would think.
I guess going along with that, I agree. I think it, right, make your job if we permit it in most. I guess my other thought is you do want these other building regulations. I'm just wondering, you know, with pitch of the roof and appearance and trying to, again, match. I kind of thought the 900 feet was kind of, or 900 square feet was kind of high as well. So I don't know if we want to pull back on how large as well and maybe limit that a little bit. I know I'm just looking at the Marshfield one with, says not to exceed 75% of the principal dwellings floor area up to a maximum size of 700 square feet. I kind of, you know, that I think is reasonable as well, if this is, again, going to be called an accessory dwelling unit. I mean, I live in a 950 square foot house. And so to think to add 700 square feet, and I might have the room to do it, would be, you know, almost doubling my, you know, size basically. So I think that's a lot. I think it's a consideration of if you're going to kind of combine it with what, you know, permitted use. I think you want to put a stronger limit of how much, and then make it conditional use if it's over the size, and then conditional use if it's over, you know, a certain size. But because it might work in a conditional use type of thing. But
yeah, that was one thing when at a previous employer of mine, when we wrote our ADU code, we specifically stated that the principal structure must be the larger of the two. And that you cannot go, if your accessory dwelling unit cannot go above the principal structure's size.
Yeah, that too, yeah.
And then, of course, which is really critical in this whole piece, is that the principal structure be the owner occupied. That that is a requirement, and
That too.
but I mean, there's some flexibility there as well.
Anything else? Yep, we'll open it up now. Alderman Morrow.
Sean Morrow, District 11, Alder. One of the concerns I had about not having a family component to it is someone might be renting that space out, and the city may not know about it, and so there wouldn't be any regulation on that. I know the definition of a modern family is very vague now, but one of the concerns is if someone might have one of these units and just be renting that unit out to whomever, and there isn't any regulation, and the city doesn't know what's really going on there, and they say, well, this is my uncle, 3 times removed from my stepbrother, so on and so forth. So that would be the one concern that I have. Thank you.
Alderman Abel.
Good evening, Cindy Nabel, District 3. I think that we do need, you know, to have some options, definitely, in town, and there are definitely people that could use this addition. I know, though, from our study that was done previously about the university area, was the recommendations allow to maybe not have it in that area to separate the regulation around the university. I'm not really sure what I think yet on that. I think if it's very much so that it's family still, and that you're doing this with an individual on your property, it probably wouldn't make a difference. As long as we don't start having it where, just kind of like what Mr. Morrow just said, is all of a sudden it's being abused. And then we have a hard time already regulating some of those things as it is. But I do think that we do need to have some types of other ways that people can live like that, and to maybe stay in their houses longer because they can afford to have a tenant, but they live there. And that's when the house that I bought, That's what the older woman did when her kids grew up and moved out. She had 2 boys, university students, live there. They ate at the university, but that's how a lot of that was done way back. And our area stayed family-oriented still because the owners were occupying the houses. So, you know, I don't have a negativity about that at all, as long as we can kind of really make sure we do that, because I think that's what made my neighborhood that I moved into was really neat that way. It was a real combination of families with students. So if we can keep that and make maybe some of these houses more directed to that way, some of these houses could be maybe remodeled and someone would buy them knowing they could have somebody else help pay the rent on it, you know, with them. Thank you.
Thank you. Alder Shore?
Thank you. David Shore, 2nd District Alder. Yeah, this issue has come up for me a couple different ways. One was a specific situation, and then more broadly, I've kind of been aware that this is a really good way for communities. It's being done in many, many places, and does have a benefit in terms of housing supply. The specific situation was having to do with an older mom. What I understood, and now I'm looking at Kyle, was that where it's zoned single family, it's not even a conditional use, yes? If an unattached structure.
It's allowed, but you have to go to the Plan Commission and Common Council approval. There's a section at the beginning of the zoning code that identifies a second principal building. However, that second principal building, in order to have it, you have to come through Plan Commission and Common Council. So it's not identified in the use section as a permitted or a conditional use, but there's a section prior to the use section that talks about principal structures on a lot.
Thanks. For me, I don't look at this purely in the family context at all. It's already been mentioned that we have a short supply issue, and so I think that's important here. It's a way to add supply. The ability to earn some rental income has been mentioned, which is similar to, I think, what we discussed with the Airbnb, with the tourist rooming houses. Speaking of which, maybe there does seem to be a consensus about the property owner living in the main structure. That does seem to be something that maybe we all agree is a good limit to put on this. In terms of a parking requirement, I think we're trying to get away from parking requirements. And so I'm not sure how important that is. But yeah, I understand the points about size restrictions and maybe some sensible ways to handle that. But I don't think that there should be a family component of this. Thanks.
Thank you. President Johnson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the commission. I will be brief. Number one, thank you, Mr. Kearns and others who worked on this. I think this is great, exactly what we need. I've talked to many people who have already thought about this, and we're just waiting for it to unfold. The other is, I think, the notion of family is probably a little antiquated. And we should allow for a broader breadth of what we're referring to, and certainly not narrow as family. I have 2 foster daughters who I consider family. They're not blood family, they're not adopted family, but they are my family. And I have mentored many of the students at UWSP who have now become part of my family and enjoy time with my family at meals and such. So I think we have to be open-minded to the notion of family and not be narrow in that scope. But this is a great idea, so thanks for everyone who put the work into it. I look forward to seeing it move to fruition.
Thank you. Alder Dalton?
Polly Dalton, District 9 alderperson. I definitely support this coming forward and coming forward as quickly as possible. I think adopting it before the construction season seems very logical and helpful for our community as people are looking to plan for their future. I definitely, I think that the family definition, I mean, we should probably look to get rid of it, but my understanding is that anytime someone's challenged it in court, it has been struck down, and then it hasn't been upheld as something legal, so that's probably something we should just address anyway. And then I would support that the owner occupancy could be in the secondary or the accessory dwelling unit, because I can very easily foresee a person who owns the property aging and deciding they want to build a smaller unit that is more accessible, so they can they move out into the secondary unit. Maybe their kids move in, maybe their cousin's nephew, whatever, moves in, and I think that's a very logical thing. So placing a limitation that the owner needs to occupy the principal seems not as helpful.
Thank you. Others from the audience?
Hi, Josh Norman, resident, student. Quick question. Given that the state has that 600 square feet minimum dwelling, would there be a limit on the number of ADUs per lot? Or would it just be one?
Great question. What I've seen in the past is it's limited to one. The issue that you start running into a lot of times with additional buildings is the impervious surface concerns, stormwater management concerns. And so at least what I've seen from other codes, it's simply one principal structure, one accessory dwelling unit.
Thanks.
Thank you. Others from the audience?
Sorry, Polly Dalton, District 9 Alder again. I'm wondering if I could hear further justification or clarification from the commission about whether it should be permitted or conditional and in what zones, because I heard a little bit of, I would like it in some. I can see it being permitted at all because, as you see in the Marshfield Rapids, there's in the rural residential and the different residency, and this is pretty common in dense urban communities. So what is your justification for whether or not you want it in residential R1 suburban versus the business transition?
Other comments from the audience? Okay, bring it back, Kyle.
I have a couple things I'd like to add, I think, before we get into further conversation. One is that I think when we take a look at this, we're going to certainly have to clarify the difference between a duplex or two-family use and an ADU use. Because right now, I think some could, construe one for the other and think that a duplex use is an ADU use and vice versa. The other thing I want to note is that for accessory structures, this is standalone detached accessory structures. In the code, we allow for a reduced setback of 3 feet if you're 10 feet from the principal building. Now, the question I beg to this body is whether or not we want to allow for accessory structures, detached accessory dwelling unit structures, to be 3 feet from the lot line, or do we want them to meet the principal structure setbacks now that they are an actual dwelling unit and not, an uninhabitable accessory structure? The reason I bring that up is because there's a lot of small lots in the city, and there's a lot of existing buildings, existing garages, and a lot of lots are limited. And the reason why we adopted the traditional neighborhood overlay district is to allow for those limited lots to increase their building size, to put in additions, to put in garages. So we'd have to think about whether or not we'd want to take the same approach with accessory dwelling units, that perhaps a reduced setback would be permitted if you have a unique circumstance that would, you know, meet the traditional neighborhood overlay district standards as well. Or we'd have to tweak those standards to incorporate ADUs, because right now they just incorporate principal structures, homes, and accessory structures, uninhabitable accessory structures. So keep those in mind. The other thing is, you know, existing non-conforming structures. So we've had some interest already from individuals that have an existing garage that's on the lot line or a foot off the lot line, and I can see a lot of individuals wanting to stick some money into renovating that facility, creating a second floor or lofted area, and then being able to possibly rent that out. And do we want to allow for that if it's right on the lot line and non-conforming? So certainly some feedback on that would be appreciated.
I will add real quick to that the 10-foot separation between buildings is part of the UDC Universal Dwelling Code, so that is a non-negotiable aspect.
Yeah, I was going to, my thoughts on it, to answer kind of maybe both of your questions is, I think in both of those situations, that should be conditional use. I mean, there may be some aspects where the lot line is up to, you know, some good buffer, you know, if it's hedges or trees or something like that, that might break that. But you definitely I could see with the small lots that we have, and even in the neighborhood I'm in and things like that, it's if you, right, would allow someone to build a structure with someone living in it, which you'd literally be maybe on top of kind of another person's home, you'd probably get into some situations. So I would suggest in both of kind of the situations you mentioned, kind of a conditional use for those if you're having a shorter setback, which, like you said, would be inhabited now, and it's not just a shed or something like that. Right.
Yeah, it'll probably take me a while, so. But I do support the idea, and good questions about whether it's permitted or a conditional use, and, you know, stormwater concerns, our basic construction, I think, guidelines would help govern that. The setback issue, and right now you're putting a residence right in there, so all these good points I generally support it, but I'd like to see some details and work through it. And
and I can see on, I guess, larger lots, it'd be easy to have it permitted. I don't think there's really any issues. Maybe when you get to the downtown and the neighborhood that we're both in, where there's some pretty darn small lots, mine included. Yeah, that so maybe it needs to be conditional use.
Based on lot size, perhaps?
Yeah.
Yeah.
One thing I'll ask the commission for a little bit more direction on, are we really just focusing on having a family member in that accessory dwelling unit, or are we open to the idea of being able to rent it out to a non-family member, rent it out for the purposes of a tourist rooming house? I think when we talk about the larger picture of housing affordability and economic resiliency of families within our neighborhoods, that the conversation needs to be based around some income-producing entity within that ADU, whether it be a rental or a Airbnb situation or VRBO. Are we completely opposed to that concept, or are we open to some type of language included as part of that?
I guess I'm not opposed to that, but I guess I would like to see the owner occupy the main dwelling.
Okay.
I think that keeps a little more control
I
of
agree.
that personally, but.
I agree that the owner occupied, I think.
Right.
Yeah, I think you hit it on the head of just with the constraints of how to raise revenue and things like that. I think as long as the language is the owner occupied and they see this as a opportunity maybe to help them stay in their owner occupied home, I'm not opposed to that either.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think when I think about some of this, you know, an initial, like, let's say I wanted an ADU. So I build it, and my intent is my mother or a daughter, whoever, to live there, fine. But in 10 years, I sell it to somebody who is not in that situation, And then they have this accessory dwelling unit that just sits there, which seems rather silly. So I would like to see it opened up to more than family.
And I don't disagree with that. I think that's an important point to mention. I will say from an enforcement standpoint, it's situations like that that down the line might be difficult to enforce because we don't track sale, well, I mean, we track sales in our assessor's office after they happen, but if there's a property for sale and it has 2 dwelling units and it may be listed as a duplex by the realtor, an owner then buys it with the thought to rent both dwelling units, and now you have essentially a 2-family use on the property rental without owner occupied in one. And when it's brought to our attention, then to tell an owner who paid probably an elevated price for a duplex use that he can no longer occupy either unit unless he resides on site, is going to be a tough conversation to have and probably pretty difficult to enforce. So we'll have to think about mechanisms of either enforcement or notice, perhaps.
And if we will take care of that.
If we adopt something like this too, I think something like this is big enough where meeting with the Realtors Association might be warranted, especially this and the recently adopted tourist rooming house language to ensure that realtors are better, identified with the code and the requirements, and hopefully we'll see compliance in the future.
I will say, just to address that concern that Mr. Kearns brought up, when I was in Sturgeon Bay and we initiated this, we did require that the owner, as part of their permit, had to put in more or less a use restriction on their property, saying that if they were to sell it, it stays with the property, but the owner would have to occupy one of the 2 units, or the principal structure in this case. And so there are ways to do that, and a simple title search would bring that up, and so it could stop a sale if, let's say I wanted to buy a home that had the principal structure and the ADU. I would have to know that I need to live in one of the 2 units.
And I like that in one of the 2 units, because I agree with Alder Dalton about, maybe you want to live in the smaller unit.
I think we've got our marching orders.
Anything else? All right. All right, moving on then. Agenda item 5, January 2020 monthly report.
Nothing major to report, mainly renovations, updates to existing homes within the city. That's about it.
Okay. Comments, questions? Comments from the audience? I will make a motion to accept the report and place it on file.
I'll second. Copy.
I'll give it to Dan.
You need a second?
Give it to Dan. I don't know. Yeah, I need a second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed say no. Motion carries. Agenda item 6, staff update.
Just a few things to note. Next week at Finance, the request for proposal and offer to purchase for the Fox Theater will be on that agenda. So only for this body to know is that down the road, probably this spring, we will have a meeting to sell that specific property, hopefully to a developer to do something with it within those use restrictions. Additionally, please pencil in February 24th for the joint RDA Plan Commission City Council meeting. That is a Monday, the 4th Monday of this month, to go over 2 things: the approval of the targeted area master planning for Division Street, and then to have I'll call a serious discussion on whether or not to daylight Moses Creek as part of the downtown targeted area master planning process. The city was in receipt of a substantial grant to have a private firm look at the feasibility of daylighting Moses Creek. We just got that back late last week, and so we will be presenting that just to have the discussion in general and see what the thoughts are of the joint bodies. So that is all I have for a staff update.
Okay. Questions for the director? Okay, and with that, our agenda is exhausted and we stand adjourned at 6:49. Thank you.
A video of this meeting is available for viewing on the city's website, stevenspoint.com/videos.